All right, let's go ahead. So thank you all for joining us. Today, we are excited for our February Navigating Market Access with Magnolia. For those of you joining us for the first time, our firm likes to do these once a month to get together with our clients and just kind of talk about some things going on in the world and what it means for you. These are not intended to be salesy or anything like that. It's just intended for us to share some insights on different topics in our market access world. And when we think of market access, health economics is a huge side of that for us. We think of the two as the commercial and the scientific come together as one. Today's topic is going to be discussing integrating health economics and outcomes research and payer considerations and clinical trial design with the goal of improving access. So I think this will be a pretty relevant topic to many of you on here. I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. And if there are any questions during the session, I'm kind of the MC today, so feel free to just put in the questions. You can do it in the Q&A or you can do it in the chat. And then we also have a couple polls today. We're getting fancy. This is our first month doing live polls, so we're excited to see what you all have to say about a few of these topics. So presenting today is Anna Hunt Golden, who is a Senior Director in Market Access and Value Insights. Christine Mulberry is our Senior Vice President of Market Access and Value Insights. And then Jessica Duchen, who's also on, is our Vice President of RWE and Health Economics and Outcomes Research Strategy. So perfect. Well, I will turn it over to you all. And again, I'm here if there's any questions or comments. So feel free to ask questions throughout and let's dive in.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you everybody for joining. So this is a topic that I feel like comes up more often than not in our conversations around kind of getting access for patients for the brands that we work on. Oftentimes we're looking at the clinical trial data and we are trying to figure out how can we use this to, create value stories that are going to help us get great access. And sometimes we have to kind of look beyond it because market access maybe wasn't really considered in the clinical trial design. So today we're going to talk about a few things, some of which are how the FDA and US payers evaluate clinical evidence in different ways. How to translate HEOR into US relevant evidence needs, ways to design trials with patient access in mind, and some common design pitfalls and best practices to try to improve access outcomes. So some of you that have joined these calls before have seen this slide before. I always like to start with our shared goal, our North Star, so that we can all be aligned, so that we can make sure whatever we do makes an impact. So we all have one shared goal here, access. We've got many different roles in our world, and we all have different individual goals. But again, there's one overarching goal, which is really to get patients the treatment that they need when they need it. And it's critical that when they're prescribed the medication, they're able to actually get it when it's prescribed. So that's not always easy. It's a complicated journey, patient access, and it can include urgency, high costs, insurance denials, other roadblocks. Which is why we kind of all have to work together in the various phases of the life cycle of a brand to make access happen. And so we need to stay focused on that North Star, patient access, and work together individually and separately or together to get us there, which cannot always be easy. So the question really that we're always dealing with is how do we find the right data, synthesize it, and translate it in a way that will support the critical decision making that we have to do, that doctors have to do, payers have to make to understand if they are going to put these drugs on their policies and cover them. So if you go to the next slide, lots of different stakeholders in the process here. So when it comes to designing trials, the really role of the stakeholder is to own the protocol strategy and executional feasibility. So within that kind of group of clinical trial leaders, you have your clinical development and medical team who define the scientific rationale, endpoints, and target population. Biostatistics determine the study design, powering, analysis plan. Clinical operations assesses feasibility, site burden, recruitment strategy, and regulatory affairs. They ensure alignment with the FDA and EMA requirements. And value and access isn't really in there, right? So, like traditionally, the value and access role, they're really thinking about how can we ensure the evidence that we have, or how can we get evidence to support reimbursement and uptake. That would include the HEOR team, market access and payer team, strategy and medical affairs. And then along that life cycle as well, another stakeholder is commercial and strategic input. So really, they're taking the evidence and ensuring that it supports patient access and reimbursement as well. And within that group would be commercial and brand strategy, pricing and contracting, patient advocacy, portfolio and corporate strategy. So all of these teams working together to get patients access to the drugs, but really all of them aren't traditionally included in the design of the clinical trial. So really our thought is that trial design should be cross-functional. We need to understand what those value and access contributors and also the commercial team are going to be dealing with once the drug is launched and they're talking to the stakeholders about getting coverage. That should really be incorporated into the clinical trial design. So goal is to, include as many stakeholders as possible, so that that design includes what we need for access. And then when it comes to FDA approval, that doesn't necessarily mean payer coverage. So, what the FDA sees as kind of clinically relevant as it relates to clinical trials is not necessarily what payer coverage deems as relevant, to include these drugs on their policies and cover them. So, a few differences between how the FDA may be thinking about the drug, when it's approving it, and how payers are considering the drug when they're determining policies. The FDA is not really assessing cost, right? We know that when a payer is assessing whether or not they're going to cover a drug and what kind of criteria there will be in those policies, they're thinking about cost, right? Like, what is the cost benefit of this patient taking this drug versus if they don't take this drug and they have a different drug, or they just are, having other healthcare cost burden on the system. Really, what is that cost difference? There's different evidence standards. So the FDA has their ways of approving based on potentially non-inferiority, surrogate endpoints, short-term data. Payers are often thinking about hard outcomes, real-world evidence, comparative effectiveness, durability of effect data, and comparison of what is that current standard of care. Um, and like I said before, even when the FDA approves it, and maybe even if there is a published policy, that doesn't necessarily mean access. We know that sometimes a drug can be placed on a high specialty tier. There could be restrictions, utilization management, and some limits to specific subpopulations. And really, in the US, there's not really a single, payer coverage authority. Each payer makes independent decisions and policies could vary. But FDA approval is national, right? There's one FDA approval within the US for a drug, but then within that now you have to get all of the different approvals from all of the different payer types based on the patients who are taking that drug. So really considering payer coverage in the clinical study again supports access to therapy.
Great. So, as Christine mentioned, we've discussed that access is not shaped by a single decision maker, but by these different payers and different systems in our landscape. So, thinking about how the pathway from approval to patient uptake involves a wide variety of stakeholders. Thinking about that, here we have our first interactive poll. Which stakeholder most influences access for your products today? And you should see a quiz pop up, and if you could select an answer.
I am very, very nerdy, but this is super exciting to me that we're like, it's actually working for those of you who work from home and or try to do a lot of Zoom and Teams, and sometimes it just doesn't work. It actually worked. We have answers coming in. All
But
right,
the grin on your face was great.
so exciting. Okay, we are going to end it in 5 seconds. So if you haven't answered yet, okay, we're going to end the poll now. Okay, so can you all see, do the results pop up? Can you see them, everybody?
I can see them, yes. So, kind of what we see here is that the plurality of people answered that it varies significantly by product, and I think we see that in the remaining answers. And this really highlights that in the U.S., access is highly fragmented, and influence really shifts based on therapeutic area, the channel, whether it's a pharmacy or medical coverage, price, and site of care. So with that in mind, I'm now going to hand it off to Anna, who's going to talk a little bit about how payers evaluate evidence and consider evidence.
Actually, before we do, we had a question come in that I think ties to this, if that's okay.
Of course.
I'll just address that one really quickly, and I have a half answer, and then maybe if the team wants to add to it as well. First of all, I would like to say we could not solve like world hunger, but we did solve Zoom polling. So thank you all for participating in our first official poll. Someone asked this question. It says, please address the role of ICER in influencing payer behavior and HEOR's role in hedging against this. So we didn't have ICER on this list. That's why I thought maybe we could talk about it at this point in time. I have an opinion on ICER, and we can talk a little bit about HEOR and what you can do basically for all of these payers, including ICER. So I'll give like my 2 cents and then see if you all have a different opinion. But I would say I've always thought of ICER as like a tool in the toolbox, that it's one of the entities that does review and consider cost effectiveness of products. And I think that they had a little bit of their heyday years ago, and maybe up until the past year or two, you would hear more about ICER. I think so many other things have happened with policies changing that just the attention off of their organization alone, I think, has just gotten a little bit quieter because of some of that. What we're all hearing about most favored nation status and all these different things happening, that I think just ICER isn't the buzzword that maybe we heard as much, but still there, still putting out reports, and definitely still has an impact on one of the tools of many that payers use to evaluate products. I would say, though, that if you think about the way we are heading as a country and some of the policies that this administration currently does have in place around establishing us and our prices relative to potentially other countries, it's almost like we're isolating ourselves, because a lot of those countries have gone through cost effectiveness, HTA assessments, and different things. And our teams talked about that a bit, is maybe an ICER cost effectiveness analysis isn't going to matter as much in the US in a few years as the way pricing or different policies have affected international and global pricing outside of the US through their bodies that evaluate cost effectiveness. So I don't think the idea of cost effectiveness by any means is gone. I actually think the concept of it is like a growing thought and a growing thing because of the way our current pricing conversations have played out. But I just don't know if we'll hear the word ICER as much. So that's just my idea in terms of its influence in the market. If anyone has any comments around, how they think about that, or just like the way we need to think about using data to justify the types of assessments they do, I'd love to hear that before I move on, or have you all move on. Any other comments from our team?
I think just another consideration with ICER, especially in light of the IRA, is moving away from quality adjusted life years, which has been a key component of many ICER models, and thinking about how to show cost effectiveness and benefit without using quality adjusted life years is an important consideration.
All right, I'll pass it back to you, Anna. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So expanding on Christine's point about designing clinical trials with payers in mind, it is critical to consider the payer perspective and how payers evaluate evidence. So what really matters most to payers? In the US, payers are not evaluating clinical evidence in a vacuum. And when reviewing a product, they consider if it's meaningfully better than other products they already cover. So when evaluating clinical evidence, statistical significance alone is insufficient for payers. Payers really want to see magnitude of benefit, meaning improved survival, delayed disease progression, or better symptom management or improvement for patients. And head-to-head data versus active comparators is, of course, a gold standard in clinical trials. However, if that's not available, indirect treatment comparisons must be methodologically rigorous and defensible. And finally, safety also plays into economic value. Higher adverse event management costs or monitoring burden can offset clinical gains from a payer perspective. Payers also consider a product's relevant to real-world populations. They are increasingly skeptical of highly curated trial populations and desire trial cohorts that reflect real-world populations with diverse representations with respect to age, comorbidities, and race, among other variables. And durability of response is also critical. Short-term endpoints may not translate into sustained clinical value. Also, adherence or administration complexity matters because it affects real-world outcomes and total cost of care. With respect to budget impact, payers are concerned about a treatment's budget impact at the plan level. In the US system, budget impact often outweighs cost effectiveness ratios, and payers are really thinking in a 1 to 3 year budget cycle. And when making coverage and reimbursement determinations, they will consider key questions like how many members are eligible, what is the expected uptake at the plan level, what is the net price after rebates, are there offsets in hospitalizations or downstream costs, and even clinically compelling therapies may face restrictions if short-term budget impact is high for a therapy. For payers, clinical evidence expectations does vary by benefit. Under the pharmacy benefit, decisions are highly formulary driven and competitive. So evidence must justify tier placement and help the plan decide why should this product be preferred, why should patients bypass cheaper alternatives, for example. So that means strong comparative data versus preferred agents, if possible, clear clinical differentiation, and compelling evidence that can support avoiding step therapies. And because pharmacy benefit products are managed algorithmically, small incremental improvements don't often overcome cost considerations unless they are clearly clinically meaningful. And net cost and short-term budget impact are heavily weighted as well in payer decision-making. Under the medical benefit, the lens is broader with respect to evidence. Payers consider site of care, administration and monitoring costs, ASP-based reimbursement dynamics, and total episode of care impact. So here, evidence that demonstrates downstream cost offsets, reduced hospitalizations, and fewer complications can carry more weight. And with respect to buy and bill versus specialty pharmacy, for provider-administered drugs under buy and bill, payers consider ASP trends and provider margin dynamics. For specialty pharmacy products, payers have tighter utilization control through prior auth and distribution management. And the access levers differ and trial design implications differ as well, especially around dosing, site of care, and monitoring requirements. And finally, with respect to the growing role of we are seeing that utilization management is becoming more aggressive. Step therapy is typically anchored in the lowest net cost clinically acceptable option available. Prior authorization criteria often mirror trial inclusion criteria, meaning that clinical trial designs influence access decisions. And finally, real-world evidence is increasingly used post-launch to reassess coverage, meaning evidence generation really does not stop at approval. right, next slide, please. Thank you. So let's move on to what resonates with payers and what payers may challenge from an evidence perspective. From the payer perspective, the strength of evidence directly determines confidence in coverage and reimbursement decisions. So evidence should really translate to real-world value. So starting with evidence strengths, payers consistently emphasize rigorous methodology and the importance of both RCTs and robust design and adequately powered trials to give them confidence in the data that they're reviewing. With respect to endpoints, payer value, evidence-based medicine, and clinically relevant endpoints that are well suited to the trial population and that matter to the patients. That could be survival, reduction in hospitalizations, or improved quality of life, rather than relying solely on surrogate endpoints. So these endpoints really should demonstrate an understanding of the disease state and its severity and patients' unmet needs. Next, consistency across multiple trials and the presence of real-world evidence that aligns with clinical trial data help build payer confidence. So ultimately, payers are more likely to view a therapy as reliable if the data story holds up in different contexts. Direct comparisons, so head-to-head comparisons. These direct comparisons with standard of care are, of course, incredibly valuable. They give payers a clear picture of how a therapy performs against existing options, rather than putting the onus on them to infer from indirect or cross-trial comparisons. And beyond clinical data, payers want to see economic implications for their plan, so budget impact, cost effectiveness, and evidence of a product's value. Economic data that link clinical outcomes to reduce healthcare costs and improve cost effectiveness go a long way in strengthening the value proposition of a product. Payers appreciate, of course, long-term safety and durability. Short trials can raise concerns from the payer perspective, so long-term safety and durability data are critical. Payers really want that reassurance that a product's benefit lasts and that risks don't emerge for patients over time. And finally, post-marketing evidence reinforcing trial findings is compelling to payers. Real-world evidence collected post-launch that supports trial outcomes helps confirm that trial results really do translate outside of controlled settings, and this builds payer confidence that the therapy's value is sustainable in everyday practice. Moving on to weaknesses in evidence, payers are wary of surrogate endpoints. When evidence relies heavily on unvalidated surrogate endpoints, they question a product's clinical significance and real-world relevance. Again, we've mentioned this, but trials that exclude key populations, such as older adults, patients with multiple comorbidities, or diverse demographic groups, raise concerns about the generalizability of a treatment. Small single arm and open label studies are seen as methodologically weaker and can create uncertainty about comparative effectiveness of a product. Similarly, again, short-term or short follow-up durations leave unanswered questions about a product's long-term safety, durability of its benefit, and potential cost impact. And conflicting results between studies or between clinical trial and real-world settings do make it difficult for payers to justify broad coverage of products. And economic evidence gaps. Models are often viewed skeptically if they are proprietary, if they lack transparency or haven't been independently validated. And finally, publication bias or lack of transparency. So selective reporting or lack of peer-reviewed publications, of course, diminishes payers' trust in a product's evidence base and may negatively impact its coverage and reimbursement. Okay, slide, please. Thank you. So how evidence expectations differ between regulators and payers. So while regulators determine whether a therapy can be approved, payers decide whether it will be covered. And those decisions are driven by fundamentally different evidence expectations. In the context of evidence generation, it's not just about clearing the regulatory bar. but also about generating the kind of evidence that payers need for confident coverage. So when a manufacturer designs trials with payers' priority in mind, it strengthens market access and accelerates a product's uptake. So starting with endpoints versus outcomes, manufacturers often design trials around endpoints that satisfy regulators, but payers are looking for endpoints that prove real-world value. Again, like survival, avoided hospitalizations, or improvements in quality of life. And this creates a gap where products may be approved, but payers remain unconvinced about their impact in practice. Next, with respect to evidence generation strategy, payers want comparative effectiveness evidence against the standard of care, not just placebo results. When a manufacturer overlooks head-to-head trials or real-world data, it leaves unanswered questions that payers must fill with their own assumptions. Next, there's a persisting gap in understanding the importance of trial cohorts that represent real-world patient populations. So trials often include those narrow patient groups, while payers cover at the plan level much broader and more complex populations. So this mismatch raises concerns about how well trial outcomes translate to patients in everyday practice. The timing of communication and engagement with payers is also a persistent gap that manufacturers usually engage payers after trials are complete, but by then evidence gaps are firmly established. So really early and ongoing dialogue with payer decision makers ensures that research plans address payer priorities from the start, which can support a product's coverage and reimbursement. And finally, there often is misalignment around the definition of value of a product. Manufacturers often frame value in terms of innovation and clinical benefit, while payers focus on cost per outcome achieved and impact on total healthcare spend. So aligning on a shared definition of value is critical to bridging the divide.
Great, thank you, Anna. So kind of thinking through all of that and understanding where these gaps might be, how often do you think US payers ask for evidence not generated in pivotal trials? Hopefully, oh, yay. Oh, Amanda, I think you're muted.
So we'll give it another 10 seconds if you're on pins and needles to see the results. All right, let's look at our results.
Great. Well, it seems like everyone kind of thinks almost always, often, or sometimes, and very few people think rarely or are unsure. And you are, oh, let me close this. Great. Y'all are correct. So some common payer follow-ups include subpopulation performance. So performance if you're in the different subpopulations identified in your clinical trial, budget impact assumptions and economic modeling questions. And HEOR, real world evidence and modeling, frequently fill these gaps post hoc. However, if your clinical trial is not designed with these outcomes in mind, there are, significant evidence and data gaps that can exist. So oftentimes your clinical trial alone is not enough, and considering this in clinical trial design to support current and later evidence needs is critical. So with that in mind, the key question becomes, how do we shift from reacting to evidence gaps at launch to proactively designing trials that anticipate payer expectations while also meeting requirements for regulatory approval? So in this next section, we'll explore what it looks like to design clinical trials with market access in mind, including some, practical frameworks and key inflection points for development that allow for alignment of these cross-functional teams early. So, when we talk about incorporating patient access needs into clinical trial design, we're talking about shifting from regulatory approval only, as we've discussed, to a patient to payment mindset. And as we've discussed, approval does not automatically translate into access. And in between FDA approval and patient uptake sits this complex set of stakeholders or payers, providers, and system level decisions. And by anticipating these requirements early, there's a potential to generate stronger, more meaningful clinical evidence that's not only scientifically sound, but also relevant for reimbursement and access. Secondly, it enhances the ability to generate and enhance real world evidence following the clinical trial. Additionally, it can reduce the likelihood of restrictive coverage, step edits, and other, utilization management requirements that might prevent your product while being covered from being accessed by patients, allowing for faster and broader patient uptake. And finally, it can help strengthen your value narrative at launch. So instead of defending gaps, teams can proactively demonstrate value. So we have another interactive question for you all as we kind of consider incorporating larger evidence needs into our clinical trial design. So at what stage are US payer evidence needs typically considered in clinical trial design, do you think?
All right, we're going to launch this one now. So I love seeing this answer because I agree the way this is happening. I'm going to let the poll go a few more seconds, but I'll give my color commentary. I agree that this is what happens, but I always argue that it should happen completely earlier. So if that gives you an indication, we'll give it 5 more seconds. All right, we're going to close this one and look at the results. So I'll give my 2 cents on this one if you don't mind. I always argue with everybody. I know in phase 1 and 2, you are just very, very exploratory. And I don't think you have to do crazy anything and put millions of dollars into things. But I do think having some small interaction with a payer or just understanding evidence for justification for even go to investment. A lot of people that we work with, a lot of our clients are at small companies and are looking for funds, right, and capital. These are a lot of questions that are getting asked now by investors about have you thought about the market? So I think there are very small things you can do early on just for some of those go, no go decisions on certain molecules or certain things before you're getting into that phase 3. Obviously, phase 3 is where like the magic's really happening. But I would argue phase 2, maybe late phase 1, I think there are some questions to be asked. So what do you all think?
Yeah, I think from that answer we see that especially in development timelines in phase 1 and phase 2, the regulatory milestones are really what people are focused on, which means that the market access side or payer and the HEOR side is engaged too late to really influence design, and any endpoints that are included are going to be added as exploratory rather than strategic. And that is a great kind of segue into our next slide, where as we consider, access throughout clinical trial phases, it's not a one-time event that should happen, at the end of phase 3 or, after our pivotal trials are done, but kind of a continuous iterative process that, as Amanda mentioned, really should start as you're thinking about your phase 1 and phase 2 trial design. So kind of what does this mean for each stage? So really our key message is that payer relevant evidence starts early. And if we wait too long, we risk generating strong clinical evidence, that's clinically and scientifically sound, but it doesn't translate into, value as we discussed earlier, meaning that we might not be able to get the treatment to patients or get it reimbursed. And so in phase 1, while clinical focus is on safety and tolerability, it's really important to understand future evidence needs that can later justify pricing and access. So it's critical to really start thinking about what are the right comparators if there is a standard of care and what the value drivers are here. That way, later trials are not designed around endpoints that aren't relevant, or surrogate endpoints that payers may be less confident in. Additionally, it's important to understand, what are the unmet needs in this group and what do payers view as meaningful endpoints for this disease population. And in phase two, this is really where I think the payer and the HEOR considerations should really come in because it's a great time to refine the value hypothesis and ensure that the clinical trial is aligned with future reimbursement and access needs. So it's absolutely critical to validate the target population and ensure that it's not too narrow, ensure that the comparator for the trial reflects real world standard of care if possible, and ensure that outcomes and endpoints are clinically meaningful, but also show value. And then as we move into phase three, the focus really becomes refining that value story. So it's a great place if it hasn't been added in yet, but hopefully it has been to include utilization or economic outcomes that can later support economic modeling or show, changes in healthcare utilization or increases in adherence or persistence. And just overall, it's important to keep in mind that, clinical success does not necessarily guarantee access success. And the earlier we're able to integrate these considerations into development, the lower the risk at launch. And then the ultimate goal is to know that as we ensure regulatory approval, and when that happens, the reimbursement isn't a question mark, but more of a guarantee. Great. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Christine.
Thank you. Okay, so when it comes to payer trial design considerations, there's a number of things that we can kind of keep in mind as we're going through those different phases, right? So it's really important to focus on comparator selection. So head-to-head active comparator versus placebo, endpoints and outcomes. We're looking at hard clinical outcomes, functional improvements, HEOR relevant outcomes, the population, duration, methodologies, and safety. So, this is really to get the drug approved. But as we've been saying kind of over and over, the biggest risks are that the payers really aren't going to really approve based on the fact that the evidence isn't clinically meaningful for them. So, it's really important to think about through all of these different considerations, like what is the payer thinking about? And what are they going to be considering as you design the clinical trials? So one of the things that we found is that the biggest payer risks in clinical trials come from placebo-controlled trials, surrogate endpoints without validation, narrow, small populations with broad pricing assumptions. So a lot of times when we're talking to payers, when Anna's leading those conversations on research, they're looking at data and they're saying it's not a long enough time. It's too small of a population. So, we on this call aren't always going to be able to have the number of people in the trial exactly what we want it to be, but it's something that we really want to be considered before it moves forward because, again, we'll repeat it. FDA approval does not mean access to the therapy, and you can do everything, have a great, clinical trial, have doctors prescribing the medication for patients that it's relevant for, but that does not mean payer access. So really important to consider the payers all along the spectrum here. And then market access considerations in clinical trial population selection. So some of the things that you can consider from a payer perspective, from a clinical perspective, do they really understand the definition of the disease severity? So a lot of times we, again, in the research are talking to the payers and they're really not familiar with these definitions. So, you know, a lot of that we can help with, right, as we launch drugs and we provide education. But if the definition is meaningless to them, then it's going to be hard to get them to really believe that it's clinically meaningful. Inclusion-exclusion criteria. This is an area that comes up all the time, right? Payers often are using the inclusion and exclusion criteria to develop their PA criteria. And so this is where we have a lot of conversations. And when we're developing our value stories, and, you know, yes, Ellen, I saw your comment that, you know, real world evidence is what kind of gets the payers to approve. That's true. We have to look at it and say, sometimes the inclusion and exclusion criteria is not really in our benefit from a PA criteria perspective, and we can get more real world evidence. But if the patient population isn't really in real life mapping out to the inclusion exclusion criteria, then sometimes it's a really difficult situation to get those patients approved for the therapy. Some HEOR considerations. So, you know, looking at the drug and the cost of the drug and looking at real world evidence to say, is this drug going to actually, from an economic perspective, benefit the payers? So, is the population going to generate measurable resource utilization differences, cost offsets versus how much the actual cost of the disease on the healthcare system is? Can the subgroup analysis support economic modeling? So is there any kind of modeling that we can do to, you know, help make economic story for our payers that they are going to want to approve this medication for? And then also some additional payer considerations. So is the population aligned with the standard of care, right? Are they going to see this and say, like, this is just like not, you know, meaningful from the number of patients that were in your clinical study? So like, we need more evidence. Does the population support favorable formulary tier placement? Is there a way to avoid PAs? Are high cost or high utilization subgroups included? So all of these things are questions that we, like Jess said, we need to like be thinking about and talking about throughout all of the clinical trial phases to think about, like, is this going to work? So, you know, it's really like, in the end, overly narrow trials can secure the approval. You can get it done, but the broader the trial is, the more payer relevant populations, the longer the trial is, it's going to result potentially in better payer access.
I just had a really great comment sent over from an attendee on our webinar that their motto is clinical trials get it approved, RWE gets it paid for. So I think that's just a good way to think about it. So thanks for that comment.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about that and RWE and the role of HEOR, which HEOR outcomes do you all think have been most impactful on US payer discussions?
I'll watch this one.
Makes me happy every time it works.
I know. It's like
Yeah.
expert now. Like I am an expert in very random things, and now Zoom polling is one of them. This one's interesting as well. I'm excited to share this. Okay, we're going to keep it open for just another few seconds. Hi, this is your last chance for a poll today. So you're feeling like you were waiting till the end. All right, great. Okay, I had some last second ones in here. Okay, this is good. These are interesting because I the productivity, that one, someone didn't reply until right at the end or put that in right to the end, because a lot of times we'll hear that, like, you know, something being easy. Oh, we also hear people all the time too saying like, oh, well, our product's easier or more convenient. It's like payers, they're, whatever. But the productivity or caregiver burden, that's one of those that's like, is it depending on the payer, right, that you're talking to? Is it an employer sponsored plan? But yeah, these are it's interesting findings here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think productivity and caregiver burden definitely have economic consequences and downstream effects. But I think, as we've discussed, that US payers manage budgets, not only outcomes and reduction in healthcare resource utilization or improved adherence to a medication or persistence on a medication supports both improved clinical outcomes as well as economic outcomes and can really help to make a difference with payers. Um, and with that in mind, and I won't, beat beat it to death here, but just thinking about considerations that you might want to consider when selecting your clinical trial endpoint. It's important to make sure that the outcomes are both clinically meaningful and patient-centered, but also kind of these more hard outcomes that are not that are relevant to payers. We want endpoints that show comparative value, that show how a new therapy performs relative to a current standard of care and not just a placebo when there is a real world standard of care available. It's important to show health systems impact and endpoints that connect to economic and utilization outcomes, especially reduced ER visits or, inpatient care where costs can be high. The endpoints and outcomes should be generalizable, so they should reflect outcomes in real world patient populations, not just a narrow, severe disease or early disease population that doesn't really reflect the real world disease population that a payer is covering. As much as possible, endpoints should reflect both short-term efficacy and long-term durability. So oftentimes, endpoints in clinical trials are measured over weeks, but payers are looking at covering treatment over, many years. So as much as possible, showing this longer term data is important. And finally, as we've noted multiple times, this is a balancing act between regulatory approval and payer coverage. So, surrogate endpoints are not great on the payer side, but do get you regulatory approval. But it's also important to show real world value.
I also think too, one comment as well is thinking about a payer beyond just the person paying the bill. Obviously, a lot of people on this call think of this too, and we see it in some projects we do where people want to look into like integrated delivery networks and all of those, but like hospital decision makers, health system impact's going to be very big to them. They're making formulary decisions, they're doing their clinical review on top of the payer, right? And they're picking kind of what goes on their formulary, what goes into their, DRG or their bundled payment rate and what they're stocking. And not only are they looking at clinical information too, but now outpatient hospitals, they're looking at what's getting them their 340B discounts and what's coming in from a policy perspective and how the products are priced and what the payment rates are. So there's just a lot to that. I think even like other payers, as in people that are making formulary decisions or coverage decisions, even outside of our traditional like insurer or PBM type payer that we might think of, are getting more and more business decisions that they have to make even beyond some of the clinical.
Absolutely. And then just thinking through some final best practices. As we've discussed, it's important to start early as possible, ideally before you finalize your phase 2 protocol. It's important to align your trial objectives with your value narrative. It's important to choose a representative patient population and knowing that that is going to be a balance between internal validity of a smaller, more narrow population clinically, but also making sure that you are representing real world patients and real world treatment and disease as much as possible. When appropriate and applicable, using real world standard of care comparators, including meaningful hard endpoints that translate to value And then just ensuring that you're not having a siloed approach, but aligning cross-functionally between your clinical teams, your access teams, your HEOR teams, recognizing that they all have stake in the game to minimize downstream access risk. So we just wanted to end kind of with a quick case study of how, a misaligned clinical trial can result in access risks down the line. So aducanumab is a widely cited example of divergence between regulatory approval and payer coverage. So it was approved for Alzheimer's disease treatment by the FDA in 2021. And the key trial characteristics, there were two phase 3 trials. They had mixed efficacy. One had positive findings, one had negative. The key endpoints for the studies were the reduction in beta amyloid plaques, and they showed limited effect on cognitive improvement. And the trial populations were pretty narrow. They were limited primarily to early Alzheimer's disease. And in response, CMS limited coverage only to patients enrolled in clinical trials, which effectively restricted and prevented broad Medicare access where there was a huge potential population. And commercial payer response followed suit. Many plans delayed or severely restricted coverage. There were extensive PA requirements, and coverage really aligned closely with the CMS decision. And in taking a look at their trial design, some of how did this trial design kind of result in these access restrictions? So the trials relied on surrogate endpoints. So payers questioned whether these amyloid plaque reductions translated to meaningful clinical benefit, and the lack of hard outcomes or caused uncertainty in the payers. Additionally, the conflicting trial results across the two studies reduced payer confidence. The drug had a high annual price with a large population in the Medicare population, resulting in potential for massive budget impact without evidence of downstream savings due to reduced utilization. And there was very limited evidence on real world impact. So a narrow treatment population with focused on early Alzheimer's, but the Medicare population includes people across the disease gamut. And the treatment also required regular MRIs for safety monitoring, which instead of reducing utilization, likely would result in increased utilization with increased budget impact.
I had originally stayed off camera because I wasn't presenting, and now I'm like all into this. And I do have sorry, guys, for anyone who was like, oh, great, I don't have to listen to Amanda this month. You're stuck with me. But one thing I think, conversely, I'm amazed with GLP-1 clinical trial planning and evidence generation and just all of the studies we've seen in the past few years around GLP-1s and all of the benefits you're seeing just beyond the original reach of the medications. And I think companies with those products have done an unbelievable job of putting out evidence to justify cost changes in additional disease areas, obesity, yes, maybe our first goal looking originally, diabetes management, whatever. And now we're just seeing so much more evidence come out. So I think, when I think about the way Medicare wasn't considering these at all, we're seeing so many things change in that. And I think that's an example where the world is thinking differently about those products. And I think 5 years from now, obviously we've got all these new direct-to-patient models for that, but seeing payer coverage for those products is changing significantly just because it's been such an amazing evidence in justification process. So I tip my hat to the companies with those products that have just done, I think, a really excellent job of thinking ahead on what they were going to need to really help those products get to patients.
Absolutely. Great.
Okay. And I think we've made it to the end. So I think everybody on this call could probably repeat what our key takeaways are. But, the goal of this conversation was really to just, talk through, how when the payer lens or that financial coverage stakeholder lens is not provided during like the clinical trial creation, it can result down the line in hurdles when it comes to payer access. So how can we all work together to, understand what we can be thinking about throughout all the different phases of clinical trials to potentially incorporate some of the criteria that payers are really thinking about. So plan your evidence generation with your clinical trials and beyond that, real world evidence as well, with the payers in mind, and engage with payers to understand, what they're going to be thinking about when you launch your drug, so that you can get the best, access for your patients. We need to make sure that our trial designs are balancing regulatory and reimbursement relevance. Plan early, talk about these things early. Don't wait until phase 3 to even talk and start considering payers. Talk about it in your planning in the earlier phases. And just, in summary, we know that trial design really decisions really shape reimbursement outcomes. So everything that we can do to incorporate reimbursement in your clinical trial design can help with patients' access when they need the drugs.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
So thank you all for attending today's webinar. We are excited to also announce next month's webinar, where I think AI is the buzzword of the 2020s. I am very, very old. I know I look like I'm in my, early or late teens, early 20s, but I remember the dot-com boom, and all of a sudden, every website on earth was there. Now we are in the AI world, right? And we're thinking about how to incorporate AI. And I think there's good, bad, and ugly with AI. So we want to talk about what are some things we can actually use AI for right now in market access, for us to identify the right stakeholders to engage. And we like to think about not just a payer, but the ecosystem we work in. So how do we influence or think through identifying people that we want to engage from the payer audience, from the advocacy organizations, from different stakeholders on the Hill, different people in academic institutions, just all over the place, right? Kind of that comprehensive group of stakeholders in the US that really ensure access from every angle. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the use of AI to facilitate that. Obviously, we all have to put our thought into what we see from AI. So we want to talk about some of that give and take of where it's effective to use it, and then where you have to kind of put that human brain touch on to really take that type of information and make a meaningful strategy moving forward for your company to actually use the information in an insightful way. So we're really excited about that topic. And thank you all so much for joining us. And for those of you that have been buried in snow, I hope it warms up. And we look forward to seeing you in March. Thank you.
Thank you.